The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Mirabel Ashcroft turned 80 years old, and that was the morning the letter from the lawyer arrived. She read it twice at her small kitchen table in the senior apartment she could no longer afford, her thin fingers tracing the words as if they might rearrange themselves into something more generous. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Her mother Cordelia had been dead for 41 years. Her mother's land, a 5-acre piece of forgotten hill country 200 miles north in the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia, had sat in some kind of legal limbo all that time, tangled in unpaid taxes and a missing heir clause that had finally been resolved. The land was Mirabel's now, along with the collapsing farmhouse on it, and the sealed apiary her mother had walked away from in 1984 and never spoken of again. The lawyer had included a single photograph in the envelope, faded and curling at the edges. 12 white wooden beehives in a row at the back of an overgrown meadow. The paint peeling. The lids weighted down with river stones the size of a grown man's fist. And one hive at the very end, set slightly apart from the others, painted a deep cobalt blue that her mother had once told her was the color of the sky just before a storm breaks open. Mirabel sat with the photograph in her lap for a long time. Outside her window, the rain kept falling on the parking lot of the assisted living complex where her Social Security check no longer covered the rent. She had 3 weeks before the management company would ask her to leave. She had $412 in her checking account. She had no children, no living siblings, no one who would answer the phone if she called in the middle of the night. And she had, apparently, 5 acres of land that had been waiting for her for 41 years. The decision came to her quietly, the way decisions tend to come when a person has run out of other options. There were no fireworks, no moment of clarity, just a woman of 80 years, sitting at a kitchen table she did not own, looking at a photograph of a place she had not seen since she was 39. She picked up the phone and called the lawyer back. She asked him if the property was livable. He paused for a long time before he answered, the way people pause when they are trying to find a kind way to say no. He said the house had not been occupied since her mother left it. He said the roof had partially collapsed sometime in the late 90s, according to a county inspector's note. He said the well might still work, or it might not. He said the access road washed out most springs and had to be cleared by hand. He said, and this was the part that stayed with her, that the apiary itself had been sealed. Not abandoned. Sealed. Each hive nailed shut with a metal band her mother had paid a blacksmith in town to forge. The kind of work that suggested someone had not been walking away from something. Someone had been locking something in. Mirabel thanked the lawyer. She hung up the phone. She walked into her bedroom and pulled a small cardboard suitcase down from the top of the closet. The same suitcase her mother had carried out of those mountains in 1984 with a 6-year-old Mirabel holding her free hand. The suitcase still smelled faintly of cedar and beeswax. Some smells, she had learned, do not leave a thing even when 40 years have passed. She told her neighbor Doreen the next morning. Doreen was 76 and the closest thing Mirabel had to a friend in the complex, a sharp woman who played bridge on Tuesdays and had opinions about everyone. Doreen listened to the whole story with her coffee cup halfway to her mouth and then set the cup down slowly. Mirabel, honey, she said, you are 80 years old. You cannot move into a collapsing farmhouse in the West Virginia mountains by yourself. You don't even drive anymore. Mirabel said she would take the bus. Doreen laughed, and not kindly. There is no bus that goes there. There is no bus that goes anywhere near there. And what are you going to do when you get there? Live in a house with no roof? Talk to a bunch of dead beehives? You'll be dead by Christmas, and they won't find you until the snow melts. Mirabel did not argue. She had spent 80 years being told what she could not do, and she had learned that arguing only made other people more certain. She finished her coffee, said goodbye, and went back to her own apartment. That night, she pulled out a metal box from under her bed that she had not opened in decades. Inside were 3 things. A wedding ring that had belonged to a husband who had left her in 1972. A small black and white photograph of her mother as a young woman, standing in a field of wildflowers with a bee veil pushed back from her face. And a brass key on a length of frayed twine. The key was old, hand-cut, the teeth worn smooth in places. Her mother had given it to her on her 30th birthday and said only, When you are ready, you will know what this opens." Mirabel had not been ready for 50 years. She held the key now in her palm and felt the weight of it. She thought about Doreen's words. She thought about the $412 in her account. She thought about the photograph of the blue hive at the end of the row. And she thought, quietly, what is the worst that can happen to a woman who has already lost everything she had to lose? She left on a Tuesday. She paid a man named Earl from the senior center $50 to drive her and her cardboard suitcase to the bus station. And then she paid $147 for a ticket on a regional bus that took her as far as a town called Beckwith Junction, which was the last stop on the line. From there, she would have to find another way. She did not know what that way would be. She rode the bus for 9 hours through rain, and then through clearing skies, and then through long stretches of mountain country where the cell signal disappeared and the trees pressed in close on both sides of the road. She watched the landscape change from flat valley farmland into rolling hills, and then into the deep, folded geography of her childhood. She had not seen these mountains since she was 6 years old. She remembered them differently, bigger somehow, and more frightening. Now they looked like old friends she had failed to recognize for a very long time. The bus pulled into Beckwith Junction at 20 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. The station was a single bench under a tin roof beside a gas station. The driver helped her down with her suitcase and tipped his cap and was gone within 2 minutes. And Mirabel stood alone in a town she had not visited in 74 years, holding the only possession she had left in the world. A young woman was filling a pickup truck at the gas pump. She had a baby in a car seat in the cab and a tired, watchful expression that Mirabel recognized immediately. The expression of a woman who was running short of options herself. Mirabel walked over and asked if there was a taxi service in town. The young woman laughed, not unkindly, the way Doreen had not laughed kindly. "There's no taxi within 50 miles of here, ma'am. Where are you trying to get?" Mirabel pulled out the lawyer's letter and showed her the address. The young woman's eyebrows went up. "The old Ashcroft place? Up on Hollybrook Ridge?" Mirabel nodded. The young woman looked at her for a long moment, at her cardboard suitcase, at her thin gray hair pulled back in a knot, at the careful way she was holding herself upright though she was clearly exhausted. "I can run you up there," the young woman said finally. "It's 20 minutes out of my way, but I'm not letting an 80-year-old woman walk to Hollybrook Ridge." Her name, she said, was Tessa Holloway. She had a 4-month-old son named Wren, and she worked the night shift at a nursing home in the next town over. She said all of this matter-of-factly as she helped Mirabel into the passenger seat of the truck. She did not ask why an 80-year-old woman was traveling alone to a collapsing farmhouse in the mountains. Mirabel appreciated that. She had learned over a long life that the people who asked the fewest questions were often the ones who had survived the most. The drive took them out of the small town and up into the hills along a series of roads that grew narrower and rougher with each mile. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to packed dirt, then to 2 faint ruts running through grass that was almost as tall as the truck's hood. Tessa drove slowly, the baby asleep in the car seat between them, and she pointed out small landmarks as they passed. The creek where her grandfather had taught her to fish. The bend in the road where a logging truck had gone off the side in 1993. The empty foundation of what had once been a one-room schoolhouse. Mirabel listened and watched the country come back to her in pieces. She remembered a path through these woods. She remembered her mother's hand in hers. She remembered the smell of honeysuckle in late June and the particular silver-green color of the underside of a poplar leaf when the wind turned it over. She had buried these memories so deep she had not known they were still there. They climbed a final long rise, and Tessa slowed the truck, and the road opened into a small clearing at the top of the ridge. Mirabel saw the house first. It stood in the center of the meadow exactly where it had stood when she was a child, sagging now, half swallowed by ivy and wild grapevine. The front porch collapsed inward, and the roof opened to the sky on the eastern side. The chimney was still standing, blackened river stones stacked by hands that had been dust for 40 years. The windows were all gone. The front door hung at an angle from one hinge. And behind the house, in a long row at the edge of the meadow where the woods began, she saw them. 12 wooden beehives. The white paint peeling in long strips. The river stones still on the lids. And at the very end of the row, standing slightly apart from the others, a single hive painted the deep cobalt blue of a sky before a storm. Tessa stopped the truck. She let the engine idle for a moment. And then she turned it off, and the quiet of the mountain came down around them like something settling on the surface of water. The baby slept on. A red-tailed hawk crossed the meadow and disappeared into the tree line on the far side. Somewhere closer, in the long grass, a single bee crossed in front of the windshield and was gone. Mirabel felt her chest tighten in a way she had not felt in many decades. She had imagined this moment in fragments for the last week. She had imagined arriving at a ruin and feeling nothing. She had imagined feeling cheated. She had imagined feeling angry at her mother for leaving this place and taking her away from it and never speaking of it again. What she felt instead was none of those things. What she felt was a quiet, complete recognition. Like walking into a room she had been trying to remember her entire adult life, and finding that the room had been waiting for her the whole time. Tessa cleared her throat softly beside her. "Ma'am," she said, "I can't leave you up here alone tonight. The roof is gone. There's no way you can sleep in that house. Why don't you come back to town with me, and we'll figure out something in the morning?" Mirabel did not take her eyes off the row of hives. "I appreciate that, Tessa," she said. "I appreciate it more than I can say. But I have been gone from this place for 74 years. I am not leaving it again on the first night." She opened her purse and pulled out $40, which was a meaningful amount of money to her now, and tried to press it into Tessa's hand. Tessa would not take it. She sat for a long moment looking at the house and at the old woman beside her, and then she reached into the back of the truck and pulled out a blue tarp, a sleeping bag that smelled of wood smoke, a small camp lantern, and a paper bag containing a sandwich and a bottle of water she had bought at the gas station for her own dinner. She put them all on the passenger seat next to Mirabel. "I'll come back tomorrow morning," she said, "before my shift ends. I'll bring tools. I'll bring breakfast. You stay alive until then, you understand me?" Mirabel laughed for the first time in a week. It was a small, surprised laugh, and it cracked something open in her chest that had been closed for a very long time. "I will do my best," she said. Tessa helped her out of the truck. She carried the tarp and the sleeping bag and the suitcase up to what was left of the porch and set everything down on the one section that still looked solid. She squeezed Mirabel's shoulder once, gently, and then she got back in the truck with her sleeping baby and drove down the ridge, and Mirabel stood alone in the meadow where she had been born and listened to the engine fade into the distance until there was only the sound of wind moving through the high grass and the small, far-off hum of something that might have been a single bee finding its way home. She did not go into the house first. She went to the hives. The grass came up to her hips in places, and she moved through it slowly, parting it with her hands, her cardboard suitcase forgotten on the porch behind her. The afternoon light was beginning to turn gold and slant low across the meadow. She passed the foundation of what had once been a small smokehouse. She passed the rusted iron skeleton of a hand pump beside what must have once been a vegetable garden. She passed a half-buried piece of china that had been part of a teacup, blue willow pattern, and she remembered, with a sharp small clarity, her mother pouring milk into a teacup like that on a summer morning when Mirabel was perhaps 4 years old. She reached the row of hives. They stood waiting for her in the long grass. She walked along the row slowly, touching each one, feeling the warm rough wood under her palm. 11 of them in their faded white paint. The metal bands still nailed across the lids. The river stones still in place. And at the end of the row, set apart by perhaps 6 feet of grass, the blue hive. She stood in front of it for a long time. The paint on this hive was still good. Whoever had painted it had used something better than what was on the others. The wood was sound. The metal band across the lid had been hammered down at 4 points by someone who did not want it opened by wind, or animal, or accident. There was a small brass plate set into the front of the hive at eye height. Mirabel bent forward to read it. The letters had been stamped by hand, and they had not faded. "For my daughter," the plate read, "when she is ready to come home." Mirabel reached into the collar of her blouse and pulled out the brass key on its frayed twine. She held it up to the late afternoon light. She looked at the hive. She looked at the key, and she understood, all at once, that her mother had not walked away from this place in 1984. Her mother had been waiting. Her mother had been preparing. Her mother had spent her last years in this meadow doing something with these 12 hives that no one had ever known about, and she had sealed the work away with metal bands and river stones and one brass key on a length of twine, and she had given that key to a 6-year-old daughter and told her to wait until she was ready. Mirabel stood in the grass for a long time with the key warm in her hand and the blue hive silent in front of her, and she felt the years moving inside her like water finding a long blocked channel. She did not open the hive that night. She was not ready yet, and her mother, she knew now, had been a woman who understood the difference between opening a thing and being ready to receive what was inside it. She walked back through the grass to the house. The sun was setting now, the meadow filling with gold and shadow. She spread the blue tarp on the one solid section of the porch. She unrolled the sleeping bag. She sat down on the edge of it and unwrapped the sandwich Tessa had given her, and she ate it slowly while watching the light fade off the ridge. She did not cry, though she had thought she might. She did not feel afraid, though she had every reason to. She felt, instead, the quietest version of a feeling she had not felt in a very long time. The feeling of being expected somewhere. The feeling of arriving. When the sandwich was gone, she lit the small camp lantern and set it on the porch beside her. She pulled the sleeping bag up around her shoulders. The mountain night came down cold and clear, and the stars began to show through the open place where the roof had fallen in, and Mirabel Ashcroft, 80 years old and homeless 3 days ago, lay on a collapsing porch in the country of her childhood and listened to the meadow breathe around her. Somewhere out in the long grass, a small sound began. A low, almost imperceptible hum. The sound of something alive. The sound, she thought, with the last clarity before sleep took her, of something that had been waiting a very long time to be heard. She woke before dawn to the sound of a truck engine on the ridge road. The first gray light was coming up over the trees, and the meadow was full of a thin silver mist that rose from the wet grass. Tessa was as good as her word. She pulled up beside the porch with the baby in his car seat and a thermos of coffee and a paper bag of biscuits from a diner in town, and behind the cab of her truck, in the bed, she had loaded a stack of plywood sheets, a roll of heavy plastic sheeting, a hammer, a box of nails, a crowbar, a kerosene heater, 3-gallon jugs of water, and a folding cot. Mirabel sat up slowly and pulled the sleeping bag closer around her shoulders, and she looked at the contents of the truck bed for a long moment before she could speak. "Tessa," she said, "I cannot pay for all of this." Tessa was already lifting the kerosene heater down. "I didn't pay for most of it," she said. "I went home last night and told my granddaddy where you were. He's the one who loaded the truck. He said anyone who comes back to Hollybrook Ridge after 74 years has earned a roof over her head for the first night." Mirabel asked who her grandfather was. Tessa paused with the heater in her arms and looked at Mirabel with an expression that was harder to read. "His name is Asa Holloway," she said. "He's 83 years old. He grew up 2 ridges over from here. He knew your mother." Asa Holloway came up the ridge in his own truck about an hour after Tessa left for her shift, and Mirabel watched him climb out of the cab with the careful, hand-on-the-doorframe movements of a man who had lived in his body for 83 years and had learned not to rush it. He was tall, even bent the way age bent him, and his hair had gone the color of weathered fence wire, and he wore a denim coat that had been mended at both elbows by someone who knew how to mend. He stood for a moment beside the truck and looked at the meadow and at the row of hives and at the house. And then he looked at Mirabel where she stood on the porch with her coffee thermos in both hands, and a long, slow recognition moved across his face like cloud shadow crossing a hillside. "Lord have mercy," he said quietly. "You have your mother's hands." Mirabel looked down at her own hands holding the thermos. She had never thought of her hands as her mother's hands. She had thought of them as old hands, knobbed at the knuckles, spotted on the backs. But Asa was already coming up the porch steps, slow and careful on the rotted boards, and he reached out and took one of her hands in his own without asking permission, and he turned it over and looked at the palm. "The same line right here," he said, tracing it with one calloused fingertip. "Your mama had it too. Curved like a fishhook. She used to say it meant the women in your family pulled things out of deep water." He let her hand go. He smiled at her, and his eyes were the pale blue of a winter sky, and they were full of something that Mirabel could not at first name. It took her a moment to understand. It was grief. Old grief, settled and aged the way certain hardwoods settle and age. The grief of a man who had carried something for a very long time without anywhere to set it down. They sat on the porch together, on the 2 folding camp chairs Tessa had unloaded that morning, and Asa drank coffee from a tin cup and Mirabel drank from the thermos lid, and the mist burned off the meadow as the sun climbed over the trees. He did not start talking right away. He looked at the hives for a long time first. When he finally spoke, he spoke slowly, the way mountain people speak when a story matters. Your mother and I grew up 2 ridges apart, he said. I was 3 years older. We went to the same one-room school until I quit at 14 to work the family timber stand. She kept going to the school in town until she was 17. She was the smartest person I ever knew, Mirabel. Smarter than the teachers. Smarter than the preacher. She read every book in the county library twice. She knew the Latin name of every plant on this mountain. She kept bees from the time she was 11 years old. He paused and took a long drink of his coffee. When she was 19, she met a man at a church social over in Beckwith. Tall fellow. Suit. Came up from Charleston with some kind of mineral rights company. He was 32 and she was 19, and he made her promises he never meant to keep. Your father. Mirabel held very still. She had never known her father's name. Her mother had never spoken of him. She had grown up with a blank where most children have a story. He left her when she was pregnant with you, Asa said. Just disappeared one Sunday morning. Took the company truck and $114 of her savings and was never seen in this county again. Your grandfather, Cordelia's daddy, was a hard man and a proud one. He told her she could not stay on the family land carrying a child without a husband. He told her she had to leave or marry quick. There was a man in town, a widower, who would have had her. She told her daddy she would rather live in a tent in the woods than marry a man she did not love. Her daddy threw her out the next morning. Mirabel set the thermos lid down on the porch railing. She could feel her pulse in her ears. She came to my mama's house, Asa said. My mama was a soft heart. She took your mother in. Your mother stayed with us through her whole pregnancy. You were born in my mama's front bedroom in February of 1946, in the worst snowstorm anyone had seen in 20 years. Your mama almost died bringing you into this world. I was 17 years old that winter, and I sat outside that bedroom door for 14 hours with my hands shaking, listening to your mother labor, because I had been in love with her since I was 9 years old, and I had never told her, and I thought she was going to die without ever knowing. He stopped. He looked down into his coffee cup. The morning was very quiet around them. Mirabel said nothing. She did not trust her voice. She did not die, Asa said. And you were the smallest baby I had ever seen. And I never told her I loved her. I waited too long. She bought this 5 acres from my own daddy that spring with money she had saved working at the dry goods store before she got pregnant. $48. My daddy charged her less than the land was worth because he was a kinder man than her own daddy ever was. She built that house herself, Mirabel, with her own 2 hands and the help of an old black carpenter from down the holler named Reuben Pace, who never asked her for a dime and who taught her how to hang a door square. She raised you in that house alone. She kept bees. She sold honey at the market in Beckwith. She paid her own taxes for 38 years. And then in 1984, she packed up the 2 of you and left, and she never came back, and she never told a soul on this mountain why. He looked up at Mirabel. I have been waiting 41 years to find out why, he said. I expect you have been waiting your whole life. Mirabel could not speak for a long time. She watched a goldfinch land on the porch railing and bob there for a moment, and then lift off again toward the meadow. She thought of her mother's last years, the small apartment in a town 300 miles south, her mother growing thinner and quieter through Mirabel's teenage years, her mother who would not answer questions about the mountains and who turned the radio up loud whenever a country song came on. Her mother had died at 61 of a cancer she had not told anyone about until it was too late to treat. Mirabel had been 39 years old. She had asked, on the last day, the question she had been carrying her whole childhood. Why did we leave? Her mother had looked at her from the pillow and had smiled the smallest, saddest smile, and she had said, some debts you carry out of a place because you cannot carry the place with you, Mirabel. I will tell you about the bees one day. She had died that night. She had not told her about the bees. Mirabel told all of this to Asa. He listened with his hands folded around his coffee cup. When she was finished, he nodded once, slowly, and he said, then the bees will have to tell you themselves. When you are ready. He stood up. He moved carefully on his old knees. He looked at the row of hives in the meadow. Your mama sealed those hives in the spring of 1984, he said. I drove up here one afternoon to bring her a pie my mama had made, and I found her in the meadow with a man from town hammering the metal bands across the lids. She would not tell me what was inside. She would not let me near them. She said, Asa, I am locking these up, and I am leaving this place. And if you love me at all, you will not ask me why, and you will watch this land for me until my daughter comes home to open them. And I said, Cordelia, what if she never comes home? And your mama looked at me with her gray eyes, and she said, then you will watch this land until you die, Asa Holloway. And that is the burden of loving a woman who knows her own mind. He turned to face Mirabel. I have watched this land for 41 years, he said. Every week, every season, through every winter and every flood. I have replaced the river stones when they rolled off. I have pulled down vines that tried to take the hives. I have never opened them, and I never will, because they were not given to me to open. They were given to you. They got to work. There was no other way through it. The grief and the history and the long-buried things were too heavy to carry standing still, so they carried them by moving. Asa unloaded the rest of the truck bed. He had brought a chainsaw, a small generator, a tarp big enough to cover the open roof, more plywood, more nails. He had brought a pot of beans his daughter-in-law had cooked the night before. He had brought a kerosene lamp and 3 bars of soap and a stack of clean towels and a set of bed sheets that smelled of cedar. He had not asked Mirabel what she needed because he had known what she needed before he loaded the truck. They worked the rest of that first morning on the eastern side of the roof. Asa climbed up on the ladder, and Mirabel held it steady from below, and together they nailed plywood across the worst of the open places, and then they stretched the heavy plastic sheeting over the plywood and tacked it down with strips of lath. It was rough work. It was not a roof, but it would keep the rain off the front bedroom. By noon, the front bedroom was dry. By 2 in the afternoon, Asa had cleared the smaller debris off the floor of the bedroom and set up the folding cot and the kerosene heater. By 4 o'clock, the well had been pumped clear of 41 years of stagnant water and was running, slow and rust-colored at first, and then surprisingly clear. By 6, Mirabel had a roof and a bed and a working pump and a pot of warm beans, and she sat on the porch in the long evening light and looked at the meadow and could not quite believe that 24 hours ago she had been on a bus. Asa stood up to leave when the light started to fail. He told her he would be back the next morning at 7. He told her his wife had been dead for 9 years and his son lived in Charleston and his granddaughter Tessa was the only family he had left within 50 miles, and he was not too busy a man to spend his days helping an old neighbor's daughter rebuild her mother's house. He said all this matter-of-factly, the way Tessa had said all things matter-of-factly, and Mirabel understood that she had landed, by some grace she did not deserve, among a family of people who said what they meant. She tried to thank him. He waved her off. He climbed into his truck. Before he closed the door, he paused. Mirabel, he said, there is something you should know about the man in town who helped your mother seal those hives. His name was Earl Pickett. He was a blacksmith. He was also your mother's second cousin, and he was the only man in this county besides me that she trusted with her secrets. He died in 1991. But before he died, he told my brother Ezra that what was inside that blue hive was the reason she left. That is all he ever said. My brother carried it to his grave 6 years ago. I am the last one alive who heard it. I have not told another living soul until right now. He closed the truck door. He drove down the ridge. And Mirabel sat alone on the porch as the dark came up out of the trees, and she looked at the row of hives in the falling light, and she thought, the reason she left. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The first week became the second week. The second week became the third. The work was endless, and Mirabel did more of it than anyone, including herself, would have believed an 80-year-old woman could do. Her hands, which had been thin and unused for years, grew calluses in the soft places. Her back ached every night, and she fell asleep at 8 o'clock and woke at 5 and worked again. Tessa came up to the ridge most mornings on her way home from her night shift, with the baby strapped to her chest in a soft cloth carrier, and she helped clear out the parlor and the kitchen and the small back room that had been Mirabel's nursery 74 years ago. They found things in those rooms that no one had touched since 1984. A child's wooden top in a kitchen drawer, the paint worn off and the place's small fingers had spun it. A tin of pearl buttons. A cast-iron skillet, so well seasoned it had not rusted in 4 decades. A water-stained recipe book in Cordelia's careful hand, the pages full of receipts for honey cake and dandelion wine and a salve for bee stings that called for plantain leaf and lard. A bundle of letters tied with brown twine in the top drawer of the bedroom dresser, addressed to Cordelia from a woman in Ohio named Hetty Marsh, dated between 1971 and 1983. Mirabel did not read the letters yet. She set them on the bedroom dresser where they would be safe, and she promised herself she would read them when the rest of the house was done. Asa came every day. He brought lumber from his own woodshed and would not let Mirabel pay him for it. He brought a window from the salvage yard in town that fit the front parlor frame with only minor adjustments. He brought his own father's hand-forged hinges, which he said had been waiting in a coffee can for 40 years for a door that deserved them. He worked alongside Mirabel without speaking for hours at a time, and the silence between them was the most comfortable silence she had known in her adult life. They were two people who had been alone for a very long time, and they were learning how to be near each other without crowding. Word spread, the way word spreads in country places. By the end of the second week, a man named Caleb Burton, who turned out to be Earl Pickett's grandson and therefore Mirabel's third cousin twice removed, drove up the ridge with a load of cedar shakes for the roof and refused to be paid. By the end of the third week, a retired plumber named Frank Sutherland had restored the kitchen sink and run a new line from the well, and the woman who ran the post office in Beckwith had sent up a box of dish towels and a hand-stitched quilt that had been her mother's. The quilt was made of squares of pale blue and faded yellow and a soft gray-green that looked like the underside of a poplar leaf. Mirabel spread it across the cot in the front bedroom, and that night she slept under it and dreamed of her mother for the first time in many years. In the dream, her mother was standing in the meadow in front of the blue hive, and she turned and looked at Mirabel, and she said, "You are almost ready." Mirabel woke before dawn with the words still in her mouth. She walked out to the meadow that morning in her robe with the dew soaking the hem. She stood in front of the blue hive in the gray first light. She did not have the key with her. She had left it on the bedroom dresser beside the bundle of letters. She had not been ready to carry it out yet. She stood in front of the hive, and she said out loud, quietly, "Mama, what did you put in there?" There was no answer. There was only the slow, almost imperceptible hum that rose from the hive in the cool morning air, the same hum she had heard her first night on the porch. She had assumed, in those first days, that the sound was wind in the meadow grass. She had assumed, then, that perhaps it was tinnitus, the small ringing of an old woman's ears. But she knew now that it was neither. The blue hive was alive. The blue hive had been alive for 41 years. She did not know how. She did not understand how a colony of bees could survive sealed inside a wooden box for 4 decades. She knew enough about bees, from her mother's recipe book and from the long hours she had spent reading in the county library as a young woman, to know that a colony needs to leave the hive. A colony needs to forage. A colony needs to swarm and renew itself. A sealed hive should have been dead within a single winter. And yet she could hear them. The other 11 hives in the row were silent, weathered, empty of life. The blue hive, alone at the end, hummed with a low, steady music that she could feel in the bones of her hand when she pressed it against the wood. She told Asa about it that afternoon. He had come up to install a new bottom step on the porch, and they were sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee, and she told him she could hear bees inside the sealed hive. He did not look surprised. He looked at her for a moment over the rim of his cup, and he set the cup down, and he said, "I have heard them too. Every spring for 41 years. Every spring, when the redbud blooms on this mountain, that hive starts to hum. By July it goes quiet again. I have never understood it. I have asked 2 beekeepers about it over the years, men I trust. One of them said it could not be possible. The other one said your mama was a kind of person who did things that could not be possible, and he would not be the one to call her a liar from beyond the grave." He sipped his coffee. "It is the 3rd week of April, Mirabel. The redbud is blooming all over this ridge. That is why you can hear them now." Mirabel set her own cup down. She had not thought about what time of year it was. She had not thought about the redbud. She thought about it now. She thought about her mother painting the hive the color of a storm sky and waiting until the redbud bloomed to seal it. She thought about the small, particular care of a woman who chose her colors and her seasons. She said, "Asa, I think I need to read those letters." He nodded slowly. He said, "I think you do." She read them that night by the light of the kerosene lamp. There were 31 of them, dated across 12 years. Hetty Marsh of Akron, Ohio, had been a beekeeper too. She had been, Mirabel understood within the first 3 letters, a kind of correspondent for Cordelia, a woman to whom Cordelia had written about things she could not say out loud in Beckwith County. The letters from Hetty were warm and chatty in the first years, full of news about her own children, her husband's job at a rubber plant, her own struggles with foul brood in her hives. But around 1979, the letters changed. Hetty began to write about something she called the work. She did not name it directly. She wrote, in one letter, "I think you are right that what you have found is not like anything else. I have asked the man at the university, the one I told you about, and he says he has read of 2 such cases in the literature, both in Eastern Europe before the war, and both lost. He says if you have it, you should not tell anyone in your county. He says people will not understand, and the wrong people will understand too well." In another letter, dated April of 1981, Hetty wrote, "Cordelia, I am begging you to think about the child. If what you have is what we believe it is, then it is worth more than this whole mountain. I know you do not care about money. I know you would rather burn it than let the wrong hands take it. But she is 6 years old, and she has nothing else. Promise me you will not let it die with you. Promise me you will leave it for her in a way she can find when she is old enough to use it." Mirabel set that letter down with hands that were trembling. She picked up the next one. October of 1983. "I understand what you are planning. I do not agree with you about leaving the mountain, but I understand why. I am sending you the address of the man at the university. He has retired now, but he will know who to send you to if she ever comes back to open it. His name is Dr. Bowen Ashford. He is a good man. He will not steal it from her." The next letter, the final one in the bundle, was dated March of 1984. It was very short. "She does not have to come back, Cordelia. She only has to want to. The bees will know." Mirabel held the last letter for a long time. She read it 3 times. Then she folded all the letters carefully and retied them with the brown twine and set them on the dresser. She picked up the brass key. She held it in her palm. She walked outside into the meadow under a sky full of stars and a half-moon riding above the eastern ridge, and she walked to the row of hives in her nightgown and her robe, and she stood in front of the blue hive at the end of the row. The hum was louder at night. Or perhaps it only seemed louder because there were no other sounds to drown it out. She thought about her mother. She thought about a 19-year-old girl who had been thrown out of her own family's house with a baby in her belly and who had built this farm with her own 2 hands. She thought about a woman who had lived alone on this ridge for 38 years and who had found something in her hives that a man at a university had said was lost. She thought about a mother who had been so afraid of the wrong hands that she had sealed her life's work behind a metal band and a brass key and a long walk away from the only home she had ever loved. And she thought about a daughter, herself, 80 years old, who had spent 4 decades being told by everyone in her life that she was not capable of much, and who had ridden a bus into the mountains alone with a cardboard suitcase, and who was standing now in a meadow under a half-moon with her mother's key in her hand. She thought, "I am ready." She bent down. She set the key on the lid of the blue hive beside one of the river stones. She did not open the hive yet. She wanted to do it in the light. She wanted to do it with Asa beside her, because Asa had waited 41 years to know what was inside, and she would not open it. Without him, she turned and walked back through the wet grass toward the house. Halfway across the meadow, she stopped and looked back. In the moonlight, the row of hives stood pale and silent. The blue hive at the end glowed faintly, or seemed to. The hum had stopped. She understood, in the way a person understands certain things without being told, that the colony had heard her decision and had quieted to wait for the morning. She walked back to the house and slept. She woke before the sun. The mountain was still dark, but the eastern sky above the ridge had begun to lighten to the color of pewter, and she could see the meadow as a soft gray field through the bedroom window. She dressed slowly. She put on the work pants and the flannel shirt Tessa had brought up from a thrift store in town 2 weeks ago. She combed her thin hair back and pinned it. She did not eat. She did not drink coffee. She walked out onto the porch and waited. Ace's truck came up the ridge at 5 minutes before 6. He climbed out without speaking and looked at her standing on the porch in the gray light, and he understood without being told. He had brought a small leather satchel. Inside it, he said quietly as they walked together across the meadow, were the tools he had been keeping for 41 years. A pry bar his father had forged. A pair of leather gloves. a wide-mouthed glass jar with a brass screw lid, and a bee veil that had belonged to Cordelia, taken from a hook in the smokehouse the day she sealed the hives, because Asa had known that someday someone would need it. He handed Mirabel the veil. She put it on. The mesh was yellowed with age but intact, and the smell of it, faint but unmistakable, was beeswax and lavender and a small clean trace of her mother's hands. She did not cry. She had wept enough in the last 3 weeks to last a long time, and this morning was not for weeping. This morning was for opening. They stood together in front of the blue hive. The hum had returned with the first light, and it was louder now than Mirabel had ever heard it, a low steady music that seemed to come from inside the wood and inside the ground beneath her feet at the same time. Asa knelt slowly in the wet grass. He set down the satchel. He picked up the river stones one by one and set them gently in a row beside the hive, the way a man might lay out his mother's good china before a meal. He looked up at Mirabel. "You ready?" She nodded. He wedged the pry bar under one corner of the metal band that her mother's cousin Earl Pickett had hammered into place in the spring of 1984. The band gave a small, dry shriek of protest. Asa moved the bar to the next corner. The metal lifted, then the next, then the last. The band came free in his hands, and he set it aside in the grass, and the lid of the blue hive sat unsealed for the first time in 41 years. Mirabel knelt beside him. Her old knees protested, but she ignored them. She put her hand on the lid. The wood was warm. She did not know if it was the morning sun or the colony inside that had warmed it. Perhaps both. She lifted the lid. A small cloud of bees rose from the hive, slow and unhurried, and circled her veiled head once, twice, 3 times, and then settled back down into the wood. They did not sting. They did not even seem agitated. They moved the way bees move on a familiar shoulder. Mirabel looked down into the hive. The combs were there, 8 of them, hung neatly in their wooden frames the way her mother had hung them 4 decades ago. They were full. The wax was the color of dark amber, almost mahogany, deeper than any honey wax Mirabel had ever seen. And in the very center of the hive, suspended between the 4th and 5th combs, was a small wooden box no larger than a child's hand. It had been built to fit exactly there, between the combs, and the bees had built their wax around it, and over it, and through the small gaps in its lid, so that it sat inside the colony like a stone inside a peach. Asa drew in a slow breath beside her. Mirabel reached down with hands that were steadier than she expected, and she lifted the box out of the comb. The bees did not protest. They parted for her hands and closed again behind them. The box was light, heavier than empty, but lighter than she had expected. The wax came away in long, warm strings as she raised it into the morning air. She held it in both hands. She looked at Asa. He was crying without sound, his old face wet in the new sunlight. She lowered the lid back onto the hive carefully, leaving the metal band off, because the hive belonged to the bees again now, and they had earned an unsealed lid. She stood up with the small wooden box in her hands. She walked through the wet grass to the porch with Asa beside her, and she set the box on the kitchen table, and she sat down in front of it and pulled the veil off her head. The box had a small brass clasp. She opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone dark with age, were 2 things. The first was a glass vial, sealed with red wax, full of a thick liquid that caught the light in the kitchen window and threw it back the color of old gold. The second was a folded letter in her mother's handwriting. Mirabel unfolded the letter with shaking fingers. It was dated April 14th, 1984. "My Mirabel," her mother had written. "If you are reading this, then you came home. I knew you would. I did not know when, and I did not know how old you would be, but I knew. The bees told me. Inside this vial is what I found in the spring of 1976 in a hollow black gum tree at the back of our land. It is a wild colony's honey, but it is not honey only. The bees had been working a stand of flowers I had never seen before, and a moss along the creek that I had never seen before, and something else I could not identify, and when I tasted the honey from that tree I knew it was different. I will not try to describe to you what it does. I will only tell you that I tested it, carefully, for 8 years, on a pain in my hands that had not let me sleep through a night since I was 30, and on a cut my old dog Pomeroy took on his leg that the vet said would not heal, and on 3 children of 3 different mountain families whose names I will not write down. It does not cure everything. I am not such a fool. But it does something, and it does it well enough that I knew if anyone in this county or in the wider world learned what I had, the wrong men would come for it. I wrote to Hetty. Hetty wrote to a man at the university named Bowen Ashford. He looked at a sample I sent him, and he wrote back to me 3 letters in 3 months, each one more urgent than the last. He said what I had found had a name in a book written in 1919 by a Hungarian doctor, and that the book had been lost in the war, and that 2 known samples of the substance had existed in Europe and both had been destroyed by the bombing of Dresden. He said if I had a third, it was the only one in the world. He said I should not sell it. He said I should not give it to a company. He said I should preserve the colony and the land it forages and protect it, and one day, when the world was a better one, my child or my child's child should decide what to do with it. I have done what I can. I have sealed the colony with a hive Earl built that has a small inner chamber that lets the queen lay, but does not let the workers out except through a passage I dug that runs 60 feet underground to a stone-lined opening at the back of the meadow. They have foraged in secret for 41 years if you are reading this in the year I think you are. Earl swore on his life he would never tell. I do not know if he kept that oath. The vial in this box is what I drew from the wild tree in 1976. It is the original. There is more in the combs of this hive. There will be more next year and the year after. Bowen Ashford, if he is living, will know what to do. If he is not living, his university will know who to send you to. I have left his address in the lining of the box. I am sorry, my daughter, that I could not give you a mother who stayed. I gave you instead a mother who left so that you could one day come home and find a thing that was waiting only for you. I have loved you every day of my life. I will love you every day after. Your mother, Cordelia. Mirabel folded the letter. She set it on the table. She did not speak for a long time. Asa sat across from her with his hands folded and his head bowed. He was an old man who had loved her mother in silence for 65 years, and he had just learned that the woman he had loved had been doing a work in these mountains that almost no one in the world had known about. He did not say anything either. After a while, Mirabel reached into the lining of the box and found, where her mother had said it would be, a small slip of paper with an address in Morgantown and a phone number that was almost certainly disconnected. She set the slip of paper beside the letter. She looked at Asa. I think, she said quietly, we should make a phone call. Dr. Bowen Ashford was 91 years old and living in a small house on the edge of the West Virginia University campus with a daughter who was a retired botanist. He answered the phone himself on the 3rd ring. When Mirabel said her name, there was a long silence on the line. Then he said, in a voice that was thin but completely clear, Cordelia's daughter. I have been hoping for 40 years that you would call. He drove down to Hollybrook Ridge with his daughter the following Saturday. The daughter, whose name was Lenore, was 68 and drove a careful sedan, and they came up the ridge road in the late morning, and Asa met them at the bottom in his truck and led them the last mile because the road was still rough. Dr. Ashford was a small man, stooped, with hands that shook slightly when he was not paying attention to them and were perfectly steady when he was. He stood in the meadow in front of the row of hives, and he wept openly when he saw the blue one at the end, and he said to Mirabel without taking his eyes off the hive, your mother was the most careful person I ever corresponded with in 50 years of academic work. I want you to understand that before we go any further, whatever she sealed in that hive, she sealed it correctly. Whatever she preserved with more rigor than most laboratories I have seen. I would like to test the sample if you will permit me. I would like to bring 2 colleagues, both retired, both trustworthy, both bound by an agreement I will draw up myself that protects you completely. I would like to do this work for you, Mirabel, not for me, and not for any university, and not for any company. I have wanted to do this work for 41 years, and I would like to finish it before I die. Mirabel said yes. The testing took 6 weeks. Dr. Ashford and his 2 colleagues, a chemist named Naomi Vance and a microbiologist named Bertram Cho, set up a small clean workspace in the parlor of the farmhouse with equipment they brought up in 2 carloads. They worked patiently, and they explained everything to Mirabel as they went. They tested the original vial from 1976. They took small samples, with Mirabel's permission, from 3 combs in the blue hive. They mapped the wild flora at the back of the property and found, in a wet hollow near the black gum tree Cordelia had written about, the stand of flowers Cordelia had described, a plant that Bertram Cho identified after 2 weeks of consultation as a hybrid of 2 species that should not have crossed and that occurred, as far as anyone knew, only in this one hollow on this one ridge. They found the moss. They found the third ingredient, which turned out to be a rare lichen growing on the north side of a single boulder above the creek. At the end of the 6 weeks, Dr. Ashford sat with Mirabel at the kitchen table, and he told her what they had found. He told her the substance her mother had preserved had 3 distinct compounds in it, 2 of which had been identified in the Hungarian doctor's book of 1919, and 1 of which was new. He told her that 2 pharmaceutical companies had spent the last 40 years trying to synthesize the compounds from the Hungarian doctor's description and had failed. He told her that he had quietly contacted a foundation he trusted, a small private one based in Maine, that funded long-horizon medical research without taking commercial rights, and that the foundation had expressed serious interest in licensing the right to study the substance under terms that would leave the colony, the land, and the substance itself entirely in Mirabel's hands. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. He had written a number on it. Mirabel looked at the number. She did not understand it at first. She counted the zeros twice. She looked up at Dr. Ashford. He was watching her with the gentle, patient expression of a man who had delivered news like this once before in his life and had not enjoyed it then either. "That is the initial licensing offer," he said quietly. "It is for the right to study, not to own. The colony stays here. The land stays yours. There will be annual payments as well, for as long as the colony produces. The foundation has agreed to fund the protection of the entire watershed of this ridge in perpetuity. I have read their contract 3 times. It is the cleanest contract I have seen in 50 years of this work." The number on the paper was $18 million. Mirabel set the paper down. She looked at Asa, who was sitting across the kitchen from her with his hands folded in his lap. She looked at Dr. Ashford. She looked out the kitchen window at the meadow, where the row of hives stood patient in the late afternoon sun. She said, "Doctor, will you give me the night to think about it?" He said, "Of course." She walked out into the meadow alone that evening. She walked the whole perimeter of the 5 acres. She walked past the hives and past the foundation of the smokehouse and past the iron pump and down to the creek where the rare lichen grew on its single boulder. And she walked back up through the hollow where the strange flowers bloomed. And she stood for a long time at the back of the property under the black gum tree where her mother had found the wild colony in 1976. The tree was still standing. It was very old. There was no longer a colony in its hollow trunk, but there was the soft echo of one, the smell of old comb and old wax. She put her hand on the bark. She said out loud, "Mama, I am going to say yes, but I am going to say yes my own way." She walked back to the house in the dark, and the next morning she told Dr. Ashford she would sign the contract, with 3 conditions. The first condition was that the land would be put into a trust that could never be sold or developed, in perpetuity, and that Asa Holloway and his granddaughter Tessa would sit on the board of that trust for as long as they lived. The second condition was that 10% of all proceeds, in perpetuity, would go to a fund she would administer herself to help people in the surrounding 3 counties, with priority given to women raising children alone and to people who had aged out of the foster system. The third condition was that no part of the work, no compound, no patent, no license, no derivative product, could ever be sold to any company that did not agree to make the resulting treatment available at cost to people who could not pay. Dr. Ashford wrote down each condition in his careful old hand. He looked up at her when she was done, and he said, "Your mother would have written that contract the same way." The contract was signed in early June, in the parlor of the farmhouse, on the table Cordelia had built herself in 1947. The first payment cleared Mirabel's bank account on a Tuesday morning. She stared at the screen of the laptop Tessa had brought up for her to use, and she looked at the number where for 40 years there had only been 3 or 4 figures and never more, and she did not feel triumphant. She felt very quiet. She felt the way her mother must have felt, she thought, on the morning in 1976 when she first tasted the honey from the wild tree and understood what she was holding. The weight of a thing is not in the having of it. The weight is in the choosing what to do with it. She called Doreen first. Doreen had not called Mirabel in the 7 weeks since she had left the apartment complex. Mirabel had thought about that a great deal during the long evenings on the porch. She had thought about what Doreen had said. "You will be dead by Christmas. They won't find you until the snow melts." She had thought about how easy it would have been for Doreen, in any of those 7 weeks, to pick up the phone and check. Doreen answered on the 5th ring. Her voice was thin and surprised. "Mirabel," she said. "I was just thinking about you." Mirabel said quietly that she was calling to tell her that she was alive, that she was settled, that the farmhouse had a roof now, and that she had thought Doreen should know. Doreen began to talk very fast. She said she had been worried. She said she had meant to call. She said the bridge club had been asking after her. She said the management company had finally cleared out Mirabel's old apartment, but they had saved her things, and if Mirabel wanted, Doreen could box them up and send them to her. Mirabel listened. She did not interrupt. When Doreen was done, Mirabel said, "I would appreciate it if you would box up my things, Doreen. I will send you the money for the shipping and an amount more for your trouble. I do not want you to feel bad about what you said to me when I left. You were not wrong to be afraid for me. You were wrong to be sure. There is a difference between those two things, and I have come to believe over a long life that being sure is the most dangerous mistake a person can make. I forgive you for it. I will not hold it against you. But I will not be coming back to that apartment complex, and I will not be playing bridge on Tuesdays, and I will not be available to be the person who proves your fears right or wrong anymore. I am going to live the rest of my life on this mountain. I wish you well, Doreen. I mean that." There was a long silence on the line. Then Doreen said, in a small voice, "Mirabel, are you all right? You sound different." Mirabel said, "I am all right. I am very much all right. Goodbye, Doreen." She hung up the phone. She set it down on the kitchen table. She did not feel angry. She did not feel proud. She felt the quiet, steady satisfaction of a woman who had spoken plainly and kindly, and without flinching, and who had understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, that those 3 things were not in conflict. She did not call her mother's family. She did not need to. Word traveled on its own, the way word travels in country places. By the end of the summer, distant cousins she had never met had begun to write to her, careful letters on cheap stationery, full of apologies for things their parents and grandparents had done. She read each one. She answered each one. She invited some of them up to the ridge for a Sunday afternoon, the ones whose letters she believed, and she fed them honey cake from her mother's recipe and let them walk the meadow and see the row of hives. She did not invite the ones whose letters she did not believe. She had learned, finally, the difference. The grandson of the man who had thrown Cordelia out of the family home in 1945 drove up the ridge one afternoon in a new car and stood in the meadow and made a speech he had clearly rehearsed about reconciliation and family legacy. Mirabel listened with her hands folded. When he was finished, she thanked him for coming. She did not offer him honey cake. She did not invite him back. She walked him to his car. She closed the gate behind him. Asa, watching from the porch, said only, "Your mama would have done the same." She said, "I know." The transformation of the land was patient work. She did not pour money into the farmhouse beyond what was needed to make it sound. She replaced the roof properly. She added a small wing on the back for a bedroom and a bathroom that worked through the winter. She left the front parlor exactly as Cordelia had built it. She paid Asa a fair salary to manage the apiary, which now included 6 new hives that she and Tessa had started from a swarm taken off the original blue hive in late June. A swarm Dr. Ashford had said was a miracle and a sign and a vindication of everything Cordelia had believed about the colony's resilience. She funded a scholarship at the small college in Beckwith for women returning to school after raising children alone. She funded a clinic in the county that did not turn anyone away. She paid for Tessa to go back to nursing school. With the baby in childcare she also funded, and Tessa, who had not believed she would ever be able to do such a thing, wept at the kitchen table when Mirabel told her about it. And Mirabel said only, "It is not charity, Tessa. It is what your grandfather did for me. It is what Reuben Pace did for my mother. It is how the mountain works when the mountain works right." Tessa graduated 2 years later. She works at the county clinic now. The baby is a small grave boy named Wren who calls Mirabel grandmother because no one has told him otherwise, and because no one ever will. Mirabel Ashcroft is 85 years old as I tell you this. She still lives in the farmhouse on Hollybrook Ridge. Asa Holloway lives in a small cabin half a mile away that she had built for him on the corner of the property when his own house grew too much for him to keep up. They are not married. They never will be. They are 2 old people who learned each other late. And they take their coffee together every morning on the porch of the farmhouse, and they walk the meadow together every evening. and they have an understanding about what they are to each other that does not require a name. The blue hive still hums every spring when the redbud blooms. The work goes on quietly. The foundation has begun 2 small clinical trials in 2 cities Mirabel will likely never visit. The fund she set up has helped 146 families in 3 counties. The land is in trust. The land will always be in trust. There is a small brass plate on the gatepost at the bottom of the ridge road now, much like the one her mother set on the blue hive 41 years ago. It reads, in letters someone hammered carefully by hand, for anyone who is ready to come home. She walks past it every morning when she walks down to get the mail. She touches it sometimes. She has spent the last 5 years of her life understanding what her mother understood, that the smallest inheritance, set aside with patience and love by a woman the world has overlooked, can grow into a thing that outlasts every person who ever doubted it. That the bees know, that the mountain remembers, and that a daughter, no matter how old she is, can come home to a meadow she has not seen in 74 years and find that the place has been waiting for her the whole time, humming quietly, in the color of a sky, just before a storm breaks open into the most surprising kind of light. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.